19, 22, whatever, and you just want that instant gratification. You see that one guy, man, he just won that job right out of undergrad or something, or she's just killing it, and they won that solo competition, and you want to be that person. But that's not necessarily your road, and having that long vision is a blessing.
I had a great time chatting live at the International Society of Bassists Convention in 2019 with today's guest. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. We are chatting with Associate Principal Bass of the Buffalo Philharmonic, Brett Shurtliffe. That's just one of many things that he does, and really interesting guy. He's exploring all sorts of avenues in the music world. I've been wanting to have him on the podcast for a while. He's been recommended as a guest many times, and it happened live, which is my favorite way to have it happen. So I know you're going to enjoy today's wide-ranging conversation. I want to give a quick shout-out here at the beginning to our sponsors, Upton Bass, Modacity, D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, A440 Violin Shop, and Colstein Music. Thank you so much, and here we go with today's episode. Brett Shurtliffe, 2019 International Society of Bassists Convention. I almost said Ithaca, New York.
Almost.
I had not enough sleep last night. Yeah,
Right.
Bloomington, Indiana. And you are Associate Principal Bass of the Buffalo Philharmonic.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
For about 12 years now.
Wow. Good to chat with you, man.
You too.
Yeah.
Very good.
12 years. Okay. Where'd you grow up?
Central Pennsylvania, Pennsyltucky.
Okay.
So rural Pennsylvania. Yeah. So grew up there. Had a great local teacher, Jeff Judd, owns a string shop in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And then when I got to high school, started driving 4 hours to go study with Jeff Turner in Pittsburgh.
Really?
So we'd go out there on the weekends, make a long day, and hit the lessons, and then a few hours away for undergrad at Eastman. Yeah.
And so I love doing this with teachers. I've done this with people who study with Jeff in the past, but talk about Jeff and his teaching, or what it was like working with him that young age. Any favorite memories or anything like that?
I wish I had more memories of him as a young age. I went back and studied, I did graduate work with him.
Okay.
So lots more memories then. But, he was such a technician, which is exactly what I needed every time, because my tendency was always sort of like big colors and grand gestures, and he was always there like, that's great. However, have you considered why you're doing that, or how you're doing it, or what the product is? What's the consequence of that action? And man, it was always exactly what I needed to hear. And he has that great way of describing the physicality of the instrument in a way that is just right to the point of what's happening with your body, what's happening with the bass, the acoustics, the movements, and every time it was just like that's exactly what I need. It's not easy, but that's exactly what I need. Yeah, he gets it.
And then also James VanDemark at Eastman, who I've had on the podcast, and had Jeff on the podcast too. But talk about the undergrad and studying with James, or anything else from that time.
That was transformative. That's really, my time at Eastman was absolutely incredible. I didn't have, working with Jeff was wonderful, and I felt like he gave me this great foundation. So when I showed up at Eastman, JB was able to sort of, I guess the word would be sort of tune into the vibe that I was throwing off with the grand gestures and all that sort of stuff. And because of the discipline that Jeff had sort of hopefully tried to install in me, I feel like JB and I were able to get into music. He is always a music first kind of teacher, just a total dedication to the music. And so the technique would always serve the music. And so he was able to sort of find me where I was, and then, just let me grow in a space that I felt comfortable with, which I'm eternally grateful for. It was just a fantastic time. It was creative, it was fun, and just, exactly what I needed then.
When he really into boxing when you were
No.
studying? Okay, that came after.
Yeah, I'm so old. No, he
Okay.
he was just getting into all the good stuff right after
Okay,
I left.
I wasn't sure when that happened, but it was really interesting. I think I read an article about that. I've talked with him about that too, but interesting artist and great teacher. And
I went boxing with him at the convention at Eastman.
Okay.
He took a group of us boxing, and I was we'll be honest, I was a little skeptical. I was sort of like, okay, boxing, I'll go. And man, I get it. Like, I get exactly what he was saying. All the rhythm, the holding yourself, learning to use your body right. Man, yeah, I get it. It was great. It was a great afternoon. I had a fun time, but it was also, I can see why it's beneficial. Yeah, no doubt.
And then next step for you, studying with Jeff?
Going to Jeff. Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, I studied with him for a little bit. I went to the University of Maryland. He was down there sort of driving between, and we saw each other a little bit less than we both wanted to.
Yeah.
So I ended up studying with Curtis Burris as well while I was down there, which was fantastic because Curtis, again, had a total different approach, which I hadn't really come across yet. It was a little more of that, like, you don't want to use old school as a dirty word. It was like exactly what I needed, that focus on sound production.
Yeah.
You know, how do we get that big tone, easy going tone out of the bass? And I loved I was able to study with him for a semester down there before I transferred to Pittsburgh to keep going with Jeff for a couple of years.
I talked with Curtis at the last ISB convention in 2017, and he told me, it was basically like him telling me these amazingly crazy stories about life in the orchestra and that sort of thing. He's some pretty entertaining stuff.
I love that guy. You bet. That was one of the best things. He'd be like, oh, well, I was playing this. I love the accent. I can't do it. But, oh, he was playing this sometime, and this happened, and this is how you get that sound for that. And it was like, whoa. He'd play, and he would just like, it was just beautiful sound. And it was like, yeah, I want to do that. Teach me how to do that.
The Pittsburgh bass scene, I've always thought of it as like really interesting. It's like super vibrant, in my opinion.
It is super vibrant.
Yeah.
And I had no idea when I got there. I just went for Jeff, obviously.
Yeah.
And so I was at Duquesne, and also he was at Carnegie Mellon as well. And what was awesome about it, and I've sent a bunch of students to those schools now that I've been teaching, and it was because it was a community.
Yeah.
Like, sure, I was studying with Jeff, but I was also playing for Micah or John or Peter, and that was just fine and encouraged. They would come and do mock auditions with us. They would come and run rep class sometimes. I mean, so I was getting lessons from the whole section. It was incredible.
Yeah.
And plus, the good thing about Pittsburgh, it was sort of centrally located. I was playing in a bunch of great regional orchestras, and I was within a day's drive to all the auditions. I could get to Chicago, to Boston, to Nashville, all within a day's drive from there. It was awesome.
Yeah, that's such a cool thing about that part of the country. Well, there are many cool things, but one is that what percentage of the U.S. population are you within a day's drive?
Right.
And I think about that a lot now, living out in San Francisco, where we got a lot of people in California, but Oregon is almost 700 miles north.
Right.
LA is 350 miles south, and what's east? Salt Lake City, 700 miles, east or something like that. Yeah. So that's a great. And then that community thing. It's really cool how I saw that this year at the Pittsburgh Bass Symposium, and just talking with people who are studying at different schools and how they come together like that, and you just have this, this outstanding bass section there, and then also, you've got Detroit not far away, you've got places like Buffalo and other areas not far
Buffalo,
away.
Cleveland, Cincinnati is close by.
Yeah.
I mean, my goodness. Yeah. Oh, yeah, all those guys. I mean, it's one of the best sections in the world. They're fantastic. It's hard to beat any of those guys.
Yeah. What'd you do directly after finishing the graduate studies?
Yeah. So my wife was teaching, had a good job in Pittsburgh. We loved Pittsburgh. Love Pittsburgh. My favorite city in the world. Sorry, Buffalo. Close second. But, we really wanted to end up there, but I was taking auditions everywhere, and I was sort of gigging in Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and all these places, which was great. But we were starting to set roots. We had bought a house in September. We were going to have our first child in November, early November. And the audition in Buffalo was set to be, I believe it was the 11th, of November. Our first child was late, and we ended up scheduling an induction so I could get to the audition. So we went into the hospital on Friday morning, went through a long labor. Saturday morning, my first daughter was born. We came home Sunday morning, Sunday evening, I drove to Buffalo for the audition, and I was wrecked. Like, just emotionally, physically, hadn't practiced, hadn't slept. I didn't want to go. Like, I wanted to stay home. You know, I had a new daughter, and so I drove. It was like 3-4 hours up to Buffalo. Monday morning, had my audition. Passed through the first round. My first response was a 4-letter word. I didn't want to come back. Like, I just wanted to go home and stay home. So I drove back to Pittsburgh to spend the night, new family, and then came back the next morning to Buffalo to do my semifinal and final rounds. And I think it was that sort of, I just didn't really, at that point, I wasn't really invested in winning. I was just sort of invested in playing relaxed, and I had a lot of emotions in me that I think were easily coming out. It wasn't like I was trying to force to play the way somebody wanted me to play. I was just playing because I was relaxed, and I'd put all the work in before, and it was just easy going.
Every violin shop has its own unique origin story, and here's A440's Michael Spadero on how the shop got started.
My mother-in-law started this business in 1982, and she was a professional cellist. But the story she told me was that Camille, my sister-in-law, is violinist with the LA Phil. Mm-hmm. And when she was maybe in high school, her violin was being repaired in a shop. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, the shop owner had some legal problem where, like, the Cook County Sheriff or someone confiscated all the stuff.
Okay.
So the only way for my mother-in-law to get her daughter's violin back was to buy all the contents of the shop at a police auction.
Okay.
Wow. So since she had all these instruments, I think that's what initially made her start a shop.
It's a great shop. I've gone there for years, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Michael. And folks, check them out at a440violinshop.com. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. What happens if strings aren't quite the right size for your instrument? For instance, if you play a 5/8 bass, when strings are slightly too large for an instrument, the tension will be lower. And when strings are slightly too high for an instrument, the tension will be higher. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Buying a double bass is a challenge for sure, and it's not getting any easier. That's why it's so great that Colstein's is offering interest-free financing on select instruments, bows, and instrument repair purchases. Learn more at Colstein.com, and while you're there, check out their wonderful selection of pedigree instruments and bows and everything else that they have to offer. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast.
Between my semifinal and my final round, one of my friends who was a bass player at Eastman was working for the orchestra in the education department, and he was like, "Hey, do you want to go grab some dinner? You've got like 3 hours before the final round." I said, "Yeah. Where do you want to take me?" So he took me to the Anchor Bar, the home of the Buffalo Wing.
Nice.
And we got wings and beer before my final round. And so that's, if there's a secret to audition success, it's a dozen hot wings and a pint of beer, I think, before you go on, and that's what does it.
Or that mental state you're talking about, because like the stakes are so high, or we think they're so high for auditions, and we put so much pressure on ourselves, and but music's not about that, it's about giving an emotion and connectivity, and I've talked to so many people who've, like, when they stops trying so hard is the wrong phrase, but it's something like wings and beer, and you did everything that if there was an audition textbook you're not supposed to do, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
no sleep, no practice.
Yeah, you're probably not like tapering your practice scientifically when you're like, your daughter's being born and everything.
I was sleeping in a chair in a hospital room for 12 hours and listening to a screaming infant. Yeah, that's not sort of in a good mindset.
Wow.
No, but those were the judges' comments. They were like, it wasn't perfect. Like, you were sort of, messing some stuff up. But what we heard underneath was something that was really, I hope they said they sort of felt something. And they were like, we can tell there's an artist under there. And the technique was, it was what it was.
Yeah.
And, man, I'll take that any day.
I'd take that any day too. Absolutely, and that's like the balance people always think about, like that technical practice, and tapping into your emotions and just all those challenges. No, it's super interesting. You must talk with similar things about with your students.
Yeah.
Too, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's always the goal, isn't it? That we lay that groundwork of technique to sort of drape the artistry on. Yeah. Like, so, we get caught up in the technique. Oh, how is this stroke working for me? Oh, how do I precisely make this phrase? But that's all just sort of in service of the art and service of the music. So that's always the goal. You ramp up and then you just let it all go. And trying to teach students the sort of the long road of art, that it's this audition or this recital is not what it's about. It's about the whole span of your output and what sort of statement do you want to make with your life and your art. And usually they say like, well, I want to be an artist of meaning. It's like, okay, well, you didn't say you wanted to be a carpenter.
Right.
You didn't say you wanted to be an architect. You said you wanted to be an artist. And so, we need the structure and we need the technique, but in the end, you want to make a statement. And so it doesn't always work out the way you want to, but that's sort of what's beautiful about it, is that art exists in the moment. And so I love some of those older recordings, some of the great old violinists, and you can hear some of the recordings like, oh, there's a little note that was flat or they flubbed something. And that's what I love about it. That was them. Like, that was that recording, specifically because of that one little mistake. And it made them human. It made them relatable. If we whitewash all that out with like perfect technique and flawless, I think we're not doing a service to the art in some ways.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I was talking with Rex Serrani about sort of similar things. And one thing that struck me, we're talking about the rep, and of course he's talking about opera. Rex Serrani, people that don't know, he's the principal bass of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra in New York. Young guy, but just like, it was amazing, just like how deeply he knows these pieces, and like it was all about the emotions of what's going on here or there, and he was singing little bits of what the singer's doing, and it's so he wasn't talking about second finger, and he wasn't talking about like spiccato height on the in the second position or that sort of thing.
Right,
it's interesting.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and that's all of our goals, is eventually just to forget about that stuff. We got to put the time in, but inevitably, we don't want to have to be thinking about that. We want to think about, what does that make me feel like? I do a lot of sort of visualization work with my students, where even in the last convention, I did a class on character building, where I gave students costumes to wear, and so they would play, like, you'd have a student playing the opening of Dragonetti, and you say, oh, it's great, and then you give them a French beret, and say, okay, well, now how does this make you feel? And it's funny to watch these, like 16-year-olds, all of a sudden they're going, whoa, da 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 da, these like just absolutely ludicrous ideas, just because they put on a hat, and then you give them a cape, and you're like, okay, well, now you've got a cape on, how would you play? And they were like digging in and like really soaring through. That's interesting. That's what we should be going for. And so that's sort of a goal of mine in teaching and playing, is to really treat it a bit like theater a lot, where we're finding something that speaks to somebody, and there's a character inside of it. That's interesting.
Oh man, I wish I could have checked out that class back in 2017. That sounds so cool. I got to start doing that with my students.
It's like, all you need are some like dollar store props.
I'm headed to the dollar store. What are you doing this year here at ISB?
I just yesterday did a recital of Franz Samandel's concert music. The joke was, as soon as I started the recital, I was like, okay, lock the doors, page 1 of...
That's what people might think.
And
I don't know.
Somebody came up to me and they're like... He goes, I loved your recital. Initially, I wasn't going to go because I saw Samandel, and I was like, nope, I'm not going to like that. But he came by accident, thinking it was somebody else's recital, and sat down and was like, this is kind of good music, like, and he really enjoyed himself. It sounds nothing like his etude work, which is really repetitive, obviously sometimes atonal and sort of hard to get your ears around. He was a contemporary of Bottesini. He was born, I believe, 19 years after Bottesini, so we know that they were direct contemporaries. It sounds just like it, basically. The interesting thing is that it takes that same language that Bottesini uses, but it's just a different voice, which we've not really heard. Like, you hear Bottesini's language, and it's only from Bottesini. Now we have that language from somebody else. So we have different licks that you have to sort of retrain your brain for, because it's not just a Bottesini lick, it's a Simandl lick, and so it's different. But it's still that great sort of classical phrasing, this bel canto phrasing juxtaposed with, heavy virtuosic passages right next to each other. So it's super fun music.
How is it that more of us don't know about that music? Do you know? Because you obviously had done your research on Simandl. I mean, when I think of Simandl, I think 38 Dudes, Gratis at Parnassum, New Method,
exactly.
Books 1 and 2, maybe. You know?
Right. Yeah. If you're, and that's what I was totally born and raised Simandl technique, which I love, and that's sort of still what I teach. So I mean, that's what I knew of him until maybe it was right before the 2013 convention when I played a recital at Eastman. I included 2 Simandl pieces, a scherzo and a tarantella, and I had just happened across them randomly. And bought some old out-of-print music, and they were sort of included with it. And I played through them, and I thought, wow, these are really good, so I should perform them. And they were really well received. And at that point, I was sort of like, well, these opus numbers are in the 30s, and I looked into it. I had one of his concertos, like opus 74 or something.
Whoa.
And I thought, wait a second, 70? Like, there's got to be more stuff. So I just started digging IMSLP, man.
Yeah.
He's got like 5 or 6 of these solo works just on IMSLP. They're in public domain by now. And I was given some old out-of-print music by some colleagues that were retiring, had some of his solo pieces in. So they're out there. And I think now that I sort of played it and people seem to like the music, I'm getting good feedback. Stuff that's not on IMSLP, I think I'll try to upload and make available for everyone, because it needs to be played.
You're gonna spark a Simandl revival,
right?
Right?
Well, I don't know about that.
That never went up, but that's really interesting. What an interesting idea for a recital.
Yeah, I mean, it's all good music. It's fun. It's like Bottesini. We're not playing, it's not deep high art. Like, the God of Bach. It's Bottesini, but it's still worth playing. It's beautiful. Yeah, beautiful.
What's Buffalo like?
I mean, it's snowy.
That's the first thing anybody would think of it. But I know I've heard like Buffalo is like this new like hip destination. I mean, like in California where I live, like Sacramento has sort of become that. You say, "Hey, I'm going to Sacramento," and people would say, "Like, what? You're going to a wedding?" But it's my wife and I just went there. Actually, did a beer tour of Sacramento.
Nice.
We hit up all these breweries. It's like in the Bay Area. If you go to like kind of the cooler place, beer bars. I guess we're talking about beer a lot on this one, so let's go.
Why not?
We're at a bass convention. Sometimes almost half of the things are from Sacramento. So we said,
my practicing companion, Modacity, this awesome app, it is so great for getting you to really think about your practicing. And there's what's called a deliberate practice mode. It tracks everything that you are improving upon and time spent in every piece. It's just so great. Here is founder and CEO of Modacity, Mark Gelfo, on what the app does.
I use the deliberate practice feature in Modacity a ton. So what I'm logging my improvements. Oh, I improved my articulation today by using this strategy. And then I see that in my log. So I see all the improvements that I made, the strategy that led to that improvement. I see the star rating as well as the time spent.
It is so satisfying to be able to look back on your history like Mark's describing. I do that all the time, and it keeps me inspired and energized and feeling like I'm really making progress. Learn more at modacity.co, and if you visit our site, we've got a special offer for lifetime access for this app. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. Steve has been active in the bass world and also the guitar world for years. Here's a bit from our live podcast taping with Steve on how he got into that business.
guitars and basses.
Guitars and basses.
Okay, how did that happen?
They're both helper instruments. I've always played the rhythm guitar, quite often with bass lines moving, either in swing style, jazz style, or country style. Bass is the same thing, supporting the band, the group of people you're playing with. So I've always felt like I was a support person.
I love how Steve describes being a support person, and he is certainly that for the bass community here on the West Coast, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. His shop is located just south of San Francisco, and he has a large retail showroom with about 70 basses on display. And these basses are professional top-of-the-line basses. These basses are student-level basses and everything in between. They're beautifully set up. So if you're looking for a bass or you know someone who is, be sure to check out Steve at steveswanstringbass.com. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, Steve. This episode is brought to you by the good folks at Upton Bass String Instrument Company. Eric and Gary and the whole Upton team, I can't say enough good things about them. And they have been on board with the various endeavors I've done online from the start. They were one of the early sponsors of the blog back in 2006 and 2007. And it has been so fun to follow along with their journey and see them develop these new models of basses like the car bass, the Bostonian, the Bohemian, and to connect with all these amazing players. I've had the privilege of speaking with so many people that play Upton basses, from Eric Rivas of Branford Marsalis' band and Lucia Torino of The Devil Makes Three, all the way over to Anthony Monzo of the New Century Chamber Orchestra, and Kevin Smith, Willie Nelson's bass player. I've had many students purchase Upton basses over the years. I've had a lot of colleagues play Upton basses. I see them on gigs all the time. They play great, and Upton stands behind their work. Can't recommend them highly enough. Check them out online at uptonbass.com.
We could talk about that or any aspect of Buffalo, but like, what's Buffalo like outside of its snowiness?
There is a lot of craft breweries. Like every block has a craft brewery, and most of them are really awesome.
Yeah.
You know, but okay, so when I got the job, I remember we had a couple of my position was open a couple of times, and I went up previously 2 other times, and they had no hires. And the second time I went, I had a terrible experience. I totally crashed and burned, and I remember being like, I hate this town. I'm never coming back to it. It looks awful. It's all burnout buildings, and no one wants to live in Buffalo. Okay. Of course, when it came back up, I was like, yeah, I got to take this. And when I moved there in, 2006. Yeah, it was not really on the upswing. It was a little depressed, and a lot of buildings vacant, and it's 8 months of winter for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe not 8 months, but it's a lot of winter. And I live south of the city in the hills in the snow belt, so we get about 160 inches on average every year. So it's a lot, but we learn to deal with it.
Yeah.
But in the course of a decade now, it has totally turned around.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. You think of it, it's a small city, affordable, drivable, right on a great lake, on a river, the border to Canada. I mean, you can get to Cleveland in a few hours, Rochester, you can get to Toronto in a couple hours, Pittsburgh. There's a lot of really interesting things going on because it was kind of a blank canvas.
Yeah.
Like, so much of it was old and just not taken care of that they were able to either sort of revitalize or reimagine all these spaces. And there's interesting concert spaces. One of my favorite concerts is every year I give a recital in an abandoned grain silo.
Oh, cool.
So it's this giant concrete tube, hundreds of feet, 10 stories high, maybe 30 or 40 feet in diameter. And the reverb time, I think, is like 9 seconds.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, but it's an outdoor right on the waterfront. So ships used to come in and unload cargo there. But they've saved it and turned it into an art space. And that's, I think, one of the sort of, touchstones of what's going on there is that people are imagining all of this old industry in new ways. It's becoming commercial space, it's becoming artist space, lots of interesting things are going on. And it's a really hip town.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's not just snow.
I got to go to Buffalo.
Everyone should come to Buffalo.
Yeah, I know. And going back to Buffalo and auditioning. So you had those couple times you went and the no hires. And David Allen Moore, LA Phil, when I was talking to him maybe 3 years ago, he recommended, when we're talking about auditions, it's so easy to see people's successes, but those low moments, or what are probably low moments, like that second no hire where like things all went off the rails. Like, I've had those moments.
Yeah, we all have.
Anybody's had those moments. Like, how do you pick yourself up after something like that? What did you do? What would you tell people?
Right. Okay. So the one that I won was my 17th professional audition. So it certainly was a curve of learning.
Yeah.
My first professional audition ever was in Baltimore. And long story short, I got there early. They said they were running late. I thought maybe I would take a nap, and my watch broke.
No.
I'm not kidding. And so I overslept. I ended up sleeping in my practice room for like an hour and a half. Woke up, realized that my clock hadn't moved, and had to go on stage in 5 minutes.
Oh,
and so we know how that is. So, check. I learned, make sure you're well rested. Don't sleep beforehand.
Yeah,
Bring something to eat. And in Buffalo, it was one of these things where they had changed the repertoire right as I went on, and I wasn't prepared, and so that just threw me off mentally, and things didn't work. And what I would deal, I mean, it was heartbreaking. Every one is heartbreaking, and it sort of knocks you down a bunch of pegs. And how everyone handles it differently. I would sort of allow myself to wallow in like awful, ugly self-pity for 24 hours. Like just miserable, don't talk to me, I hate the world, I'm never playing again. But once those 24 hours were up, I just shut it off and started again.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's not a magic formula to it. I knew I loved it enough. And I was getting the feedback. I was making sure I was getting external feedback that I was on the right track.
Yeah.
People that I trusted, Jeff and JB, and I'd play for these people a lot. And guys in the section in Pittsburgh, get the right kind of feedback. And if they were giving me the good feedback, and I still loved it, I was gonna just start again.
Yeah.
New day.
Yeah.
And that's all it was.
It's a good thing. I sort of discovered years ago when I didn't do well in an audition, or when something that I wish hadn't happened. I have the same thing. It takes me about a day. I'm just going to feel bad for a day.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And then it's just going to change, and that's true when. Eva, I've had moments like that even the last year or two.
Oh,
it's
all
like,
the
all right,
time. Yeah.
I know, but just let it. Everything will reset.
That is life, isn't it? Yeah,
that is life.
Yeah, and it's like after those 24 hours, I would usually write down sort of some notes from the day, what they asked for, how I felt I played each one, circumstances like, were they running late? Did I have a hard time finding parking? Yada yada. And I would sort of try to find, sort of strings across the map that made sense. Like, look, these last 4 auditions, I didn't find parking right away, and I was rushed, and like I didn't feel centered. So maybe I'll start going a little earlier and like make sure I have enough time. I put rosin on right before I played these excerpts instead of just trusting that it was going to work for me, and then I was getting too crunchy. Those sorts of things that, after you let it pass, you start to sort of analyze what went wrong and learn, like we all do, about, why did it go wrong and how can I fix that next time, not just trying to bang your head against the same thing every time, and that's for most of us, that's how it works. You get better with each one. Yeah.
Yep, and it's a slow progression.
I'm slow for me, for sure.
I'm working on, it's not an exact parallel, but I'm trying to learn Spanish because I keep going to all these events where I'm the only person who speaks doesn't speak Spanish, and I realize how desperately I need to get better, because I just feel you're in a crowd of people and everybody speaks Spanish and they're speaking English to be nice to you. Right. So I'm on day 221, I think. And I still can't speak Spanish, but I can speak more than I could 221 days ago.
Right, exactly.
I think it's a similar thing. It's a very long, or practicing or anything. It's good to take a long view.
That long view. And it's tough when I remember when I was 19, 22, whatever, and you just want that instant gratification. You see that one guy, man, he just won that job right out of undergrad or something, or she's just killing it, and they won that solo competition.
Yep.
And you want to be that person.
Yep.
But that's not necessarily your road.
Exactly.
And having that long vision is a blessing.
Yeah.
And I try to tell my students, like, look, I'm trusting in you, trust in me. Like, you've got a road to walk, and you'll get there. In our own time. Yeah. And that's a tough thing to trust sometimes, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Brett, you rock.
Thank you.
It's great. We got to do a round 2 sometime.
That'd be awesome.
There's so much we could talk about. We could do an episode just talking about like every excerpt and getting the music into it. That might be very dry and technical, but that might be awesome too at the same time.
Excerpts are not dry and man, when I started like practicing excerpts really heavily, I was more a solo player.
Yeah.
And so it took me a while.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to figure out how to keep them from being dry and technical.
Right.
But
right.
Man, once you get that, excerpts are fun.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should stop. I don't know why the first words that came out of my mouth are dry and technical.
No, me too.
Because I agree, but yet in the back of my mind somewhere, I still got that baked into my from who knows what time in life.
Yeah, exactly.
But I appreciate you, man.
Next
I appreciate what you do.
Yeah.
It's great.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate what you do too.
Yeah, cool.
Thanks again for chatting, Brett. Folks, learn more about everything he's up to at his website, brettshurtliffe.com, and we will link up to it in the show notes. I'm looking at his website right now, and I'll just give you a quote which will make you want to go to his website. "Not even Johann Sebastian shredded as hard as this guy," says the Buffalo art voice. Okay. Got to go there. Got to check it out. Brett, thank you. And thank you to everybody who listens to this podcast and listened to this podcast and has been listening over the years. I totally appreciate it. If you haven't downloaded our app, check it out. It's a great way to not only listen to the show, but stay tied into the bass world in general. And it's full of sheet music, instructional videos, writing about the bass going back well over a decade, and every single podcast episode we've ever done. You can download any of this material. You can share it. You can look at it in the iPad or Android tablet or iPhone or Android phone or a Kindle. You name it. It's all totally free. Just search for it wherever you get your stuff, that kind of stuff, or go to contrabassconversations.com/app. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and award-winning bass maker Mitch Mooring. Learn more about everything he does at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper of the Backstage Creative Podcast for archiving and cataloging everything we talk about on this show. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.